So welcome everybody to our third session. We're now live and we are talking now about perspectives on language diversity and standardization in particular. And I'm really pleased and grateful to have Professor Carlos Faraco here, Paul O'Neill. Paul, we have met moons ago briefly. Nice to see you again. And Liv is across the corridor from me, but many thanks to all of you for joining us. And Silvia is now going to introduce you to the audience a little bit more fully than that.
Yeah, it's a very brief presentation. Thank everybody for being here. Well, we have now in this third panel, Professor Carlos Alberto Faraco, who is a professor at the Federal University of Paraná. After his undergraduate course in Pontifícia Universidade Católica of Paraná, he received his master's degree in linguistics from the State University of California. From the University of Campinas, and a PhD in linguistics from the University of Salford. He also did a fellowship in linguistics at the University of California. He has great experience in the fields of linguistics, social linguistics, history of linguistic thought, historiography of linguistics grammar, applied linguistics, teaching of Portuguese, and other fields of languages. He is linked to the historiography group in Paraíba, and also in the project Pronome Plural that I coordinate. Well, he's one of my researchers on the theme of standardization, so I think we'll reach a great talk. Recent publication includes his grammar with Francisco Eduardo Vieira, among other titles. Well, thank you for being with us. Paul O'Neill, after a long time, he worked for the University of Sheffield. He's now a professor at Roman philology at, I think we can say, Ludwig-Maxsmillians-Universitat Munchen. I don't know if you can pronounce this like this. Paul completed his undergraduate degree in classics and Spanish at the University of Oxford. He then moved to Madrid to carry out the Spanish equivalent of a Master of Philosophy in Linguística Teórica e suas aplicações at the Instituto Universitário de Investigación, Ortega y Gasset, affiliated to the Universidade Autónoma de Madrid. He wrote his Master of Philosophy thesis on the phonetics of the Andalusian variety of Spanish. He returned to Oxford and completed on the Ibero-Romance verb. So Paul's research focused on variation change in the Ibero-Romance language, Spanish, Catalan, Portuguese, Galician, Asturian, Aragonese, and especially on the varieties of Portuguese, including Brazilian Portuguese and Spanish spoken around the world. Research includes several articles. Among them, I can highlight language and education in the Lusófono world, or, for example, language and education in Brazil, a historical and critical social perspective. Thank you very much, Pony, for being here. And now we have also Dr. Olivia Walsh. She received her master's degree from the University of Oxford and her PhD from the University of Cambridge. In her work, she compared the language purism in France and Quebec by examining language ideology, indeed in three perspectives of this language ideology. Her main research interests are as follows: linguistic purism, language standardization, prescriptivism, language attitudes, language contact, historical social links, heritage links. As an associate professor in French in the Francophone Studies here in the University of Nottingham, she is currently working on two research projects. The first one with Thomas Goddard, she's working with the French language community in UK. And in the second one, she's also participating in the larger corpus-based project, Corpus de Remarques sur la langue française, under the direction of Professor Iris Bennett. Recent publication includes, for example, metaphor as a manifestation of prescriptivism, discourse analysis of print media, and many, many other articles. So I think we have three great specialists on the questions related to standardization. And so we'll begin to talk about your great experience. Nicola is going to make the first question for all three.
Great, thank you for that introduction, and yeah, we're delighted to have the three of you here. Thanks very much. Could I just ask Carlos Faraco for you to start first, just to say a little bit about your perspective, your expertise on standardization, where you're coming from. You're on mute at the moment.
No sound.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, I would like to say hello to everyone that is participating in this symposium, and to thank you, Nicola, Silvia, and Maíra, for the invitation to be part of it. I'm very glad to share this panel with Paul and Liv. Well, I have been dedicating myself to the standardization of Brazilian Portuguese in two directions: the history of the standardization process and the social attitudes towards what we could call standard and non-standard Brazilian Portuguese. I understand that the results of this historical research bring some consequences for our studies of standardization in multilingual societies. And I'd like to point out some of these consequences in this short presentation. Brazilian society emerged from a colonial society in which the economy was based on slavery. First, the native peoples were enslaved, and then about 4 million Africans were brought to Brazil over 3 centuries. From the outset, Brazilian society was marked by extensive linguistic diversity, with the presence of a wide variety of indigenous native languages and African languages in different linguistic networks among them, and with Portuguese. At the same time, being a society based on slavery, it was marked by a deep socioeconomic divide, with the majority of the population having no access at all to education and to the goods of literate culture. From this situation arose a fracture between the Portuguese used by the tiny socioeconomic elite and the Portuguese spoken by the enslaved and the poor population, which has become the so-called popular Brazilian Portuguese, a radically stigmatized set of varieties of Brazilian Portuguese. Thus, the process of standardization of Brazilian Portuguese in the 19th century was guided by 2 main principles. The first one, the denial of diversity, and the attempt to impose an exocentric norm. In other words, the heterogeneous linguistic reality of Brazil was denied, and a presumed unity of the language was defended, taking as a standardizing reference the standard variety of European Portuguese. I would say that such a standardization process is characteristic of societies emerging from colonialism, as can be observed today in vivo in African societies that have Portuguese as their official language. Although linguists are seeking to describe the characteristics that Portuguese acquires in contact with African languages in those societies, the social cultural elite still defends Lisbon Portuguese as the standardization reference, a quite chimerical goal, I would say, from our Brazilian experience.
Oh, very, very good. Now we have Paul, isn't it?
Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen.
Okay.
1 second, entire screen, share. So can you see it? Yes? Can you see it? Can you see perspectives of language diversity and standardization?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. So I came to, so my research really is, I'm a historical linguist to look at language variation and change, and particularly morphology. And I came to issues related to standardization when I late on in life came to learn Brazilian Portuguese. And I was so shocked at how different the reality of speech in Brazil was with what was the standard. And my question was, how are they so different? And researching into that and writing an article on that made me gain an awareness of the importance of standardization for linguistic theory. And I'm not the first one to say this. Milroy said it in 2001, that the fact that standard language ideologies are prominent in standard language cultures, and this has had an effect on theories of language. So this is the idea that languages have an autonomous existence separate from the speakers. And the idea of standard language cultures is that the standard or a language is very clearly delimited in the mind. And in turn, this has had an effect on what linguists actually think about languages, that language is something fixed in the mind. It is a linguistic system. It's got a stabled and focused grammar, both in the minds of the individuals and the community. And the assumption is that people's linguistic behavior tends to become homogenous over time. And what I actually look at now, and specifically in Brazilian Portuguese, is the idea of idiosyncratic variation. So this is variation which does not correspond to any grammatical function, and it doesn't correspond to any social marker. Now, the prevalence of idiosyncratic variation is a problem for linguistic theories, because what one dominant assumption in language variation and change is this assumption of Lebov's, which is orderly heterogeneity, and that is that language variation is not random or idiosyncratic, but when it's not grammatically governed, it's structured along social dimensions, whereby linguistic variables can be indexicable of some type of social meaning. And so we've seen that in the quote by Chambers, that language, the essential function of language is to mark group membership. Now, studies in paired wave variation, sociolinguistics, and think about Eckert have moved away from such homogenizing tendencies, but there's still this assumption that language is not idiosyncratic or crazy, it's ordered. And the job of linguists is to find the order in all this chaos. But one thing that I'm looking at, specifically in Brazilian Portuguese, is the idea of overabundance or idiosyncratic variation. Two different ways to say the same thing. And as I've said, you can see there in the quote, and I've got some examples from Italian and some examples from German there. And as it says in the quote there from Emma Thornton, that most linguists assume that having two ways to say the same thing can only exist as a transitional stage, and that over time you'll just end up with having one. And then when you go to Brazil, you see lots of idiosyncratic variation. So I've given some examples here. In imperatives, you can say faz isso or faça isso, and in the plural, there are many different ways of saying the imperatives. And what's interesting is that a number of studies have highlighted the prevalence of idiosyncratic variation. And the best study is actually by Dorian, and she's looked at the Gaelic of fisherfolk communities in Scotland. And she shows, as I say there on the slide, that even the oldest, most fluent members speak a Gaelic that abounded in idiosyncratic variation. And so it was very, very prevalent in these varieties. And she said the social structure of the speech community is really important. And I'll finish now. And she identifies that what's important is small population, absence of socioeconomic differentiation, whether it's a minority language, and a lack of a written standard. And so what I'm looking at is in Brazilian Portuguese, and I'm highlighting that what seems to be the most important is this lack of a written standard, and the relationship between the standard and the actual written form can actually have a huge influence on language. And so as not to take up too much time, I shall stop there. Stop sharing.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. Thank you very much. Now, please, Liv.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. My research centres on the field of language, attitudes and ideologies in French language. So the themes of diversity and standardisation are really central to my work, and particularly because French is a very highly standardised language, and French speakers in France in particular are viewed as being very highly prescriptive and as adhering very strongly to the standard language ideology. So I've looked at language attitudes and ideologies in French in various contexts. So I've looked at speakers of French in France and Quebec in the current day, and I've looked at the language ideologies created and recreated in metalinguistic texts and media texts, so usage guides, newspaper articles about language from the 18th to the 20th centuries. And then most recently, I've started to look at attitudes towards French amongst French speakers who live outside French-speaking countries, so in the US and the UK, for example. And my research in Quebec, I think, really, I suppose, got me interested in the question of diversity, because it really demonstrates some of the outcomes of the relationship between standardization and diversity. So the emphasis on language uniformity in discourses around standardization led to really quite severe linguistic insecurity in the past in Quebec. So in these 20th century newspaper articles about language that I've looked at, most of the space in them is taken up either with chastising readers, so telling them off for their non-standard uses of French. That can be the use of anglicisms or just errors that are perceived to be ungrammatical, or else in encouraging them to speak better French. And by that means speak a French that's closer to the French of France. So linguistic diversity is viewed very negatively, and speakers who don't speak a language that approximates to the standard French of France are seen as deficient, even though they live in an entirely different continent, in a different context. So that led speakers in Quebec in the past to become really worried about the quality of their French, and it led to this really high linguistic insecurity. But it didn't actually change the way they spoke. It just changed how they thought about how they spoke. And in my more recent sociolinguistic research on French speakers in France and Quebec, it's still really clear that usages that are seen to deviate from the prescribed norm are viewed quite negatively by a lot of speakers, and there's quite a lot of linguistic insecurity still. So in interviews sociolinguistic interviews that I was doing, participants often apologized for their French because they didn't think it was good enough for them to be talking about it, if you like. And I've been working recently on a metalinguistic text from the 18th century in France, and it brings up exactly the same kinds of issues. So this volume was written because the author was worried that the variety of French spoken by people in Toulouse, in the south of France, was too influenced by contact with the local language variety called Gascon. And so he thought the French wasn't close enough to the standard French used in Paris. And a lot of the work focuses on the ridicule that he thinks these speakers are going to experience if they continue to speak this kind of French. And this is well before standard French had spread across France. So these ideas about homogeneity and uniformity and the rejection of diversity have really long roots. But I would say, I guess, things are slowly beginning to change. So a lot of participants in my research show an awareness of context and register, and also differences between written and spoken French. That's really not apparent in the language columns in the 20th century or in the 18th century text. So in those languages just presented as either being standard and acceptable or non-standard and unacceptable, and context or medium isn't really discussed. So I guess speakers are becoming aware of that. And as well in Quebec, French speakers are becoming more open to the idea that pluricentric standards can exist. That's quite a new idea for French, that there can be more than one centre for the standard language. But even then, it's still quite clear that even if people are starting to talk about this, it's still made really clear that the varieties can't be too different from each other. So there's
I'm going to have to, sorry, that's all great. Great, no, thank you.
I was actually finished, so you're good.
Perfect. Yeah, so thank you very much, everybody. And it's really interesting to hear Liv's, what Liv's got to say about French in Quebec and comparing that, or wondering how comparable it is with Brazilian, with Portuguese in Brazil. Perhaps we'll have time to come back to that. But now I'm going to ask Paul to be the first speaker to talk about the next couple of points that we gave you. So language diversity, standardization research, in particular from the perspective of dominant, non-dominant varieties, global south, decolonizing, and your future perspectives.
I'll just share my screen again. So going back to Can you see the slide where it says standard language cultures and an arrow towards language theories? Yeah?
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, you can see that. So going back to my point, whereby lots of assumptions in linguistic theory is based on the fact that many linguists come from standard language cultures and have very deeply ingrained notions about standard language ideologies, and they in turn have affected how we think about language. Then what I think is important going forward for research is to think about non-Western contexts. And I won't read out these quotes, I'll let you read them yourself. But once we go to non-Western contexts, this idea of a language is being questioned, to the extent that it's being claimed that language is not a universal category. And this to me seems problematic, because do we not want to say that language is universal for all humans? And what the problem is in a sense in which this term is currently used. And an example of this can be, if we, on my next slide, is how linguistic ideologies have had an effect in how people view languages. If we go to, for example, the person who wrote the grammar of the Marathi language, and I will read this out, and he says, the main purpose of writing this grammar is to regulate as far as possible this language, which is very much cluttered because no one ever tried to regulate her till date, and which is mattered with lots of tangles since nobody did a coiffure for her with a comb of grammar and bring her into a state of resolution by untangling some of the layers which were entangled for a long time. And I think going forward, what we have to not have this Western view of what a language is, and at the same time to be able to take on face value these knots and tangles in language, like the massive variation that we see in Brazilian Portuguese, and not think of it as something strange, but actually as something which is really interesting and which requires research, why there is such variation and such idiosyncratic variation. And that takes me on to the second point, which is what is very a common assumption is language is this dichotomy between the internal and the external. And we've got it first from Saussure and then from Chomsky. And the basic idea is that the internal is the rules, it's the system, it's bounded, it's closed, it's coherent, and it is essentially free from social, cultural, and political and historical association. And I think that's one thing that we need to sort of do away with, and to see that actually the external can have a lot of effects on the internal. And to just give an example of that, I think would be language ideologies, the relationship with the standard, and how this can have a direct influence on the amount of variation and also the amount of idiosyncratic variation. And to just give one example from Brazil is, if we look at the question I have when I look at Brazilian Portuguese and I say, why is there so much variation, is I always compare it with the Spanish of Spain, the Spanish of Latin America. So the Spanish of Madrid and the Spanish of Mexico are really quite similar when compared with how different the Portuguese of Portugal is and how different the Portuguese of Brazil is. And what we see, if we look historically at the Portuguese and the Spanish Empire, if we see that the first printing presses in universities from the colonial period were very, very early on. However, in Brazil, there was no printing press or university till after independence. And this had major effects for the linguistic development of Portuguese in Brazil, since not having a university hindered the development of a centralized, educated, spoken colonial norm, and not having a printing press limited the access to and the circulation of the written words, and thus forestalled the establishment of a literate written culture. And both of these factors contributed to the whole-scale lack of a linguistic model for the great majority of colonists to emulate. And this is in stark contrast to what happens in Spanish America. And so what I'm currently looking at, and what I think is interesting to see to what extent language ideologies, the importance which language was historically, can actually have a direct impact on the grammar. And then if I've got 2 more minutes, I'm just going to say what I also think is important. Another for future research, and this is the idea of morphological complexity. So morphological complexity is a big topic in morphological theory, and it's how complex you can say your morphological system is. So if you, for example, if you compare German with its case system with English, then English is very morphologically reduced, where German is very morphologically complex. And it's often regarded that the European languages are more morphologically complex than the languages which were taken over to the Americas. In this case, this would be Standard Spanish, Standard Portuguese from Europe versus the American varieties. And what research has seen is that complexity varies considerably, but the following tendencies are valid for all languages. So languages are less morphologically complex when they're spoken by large populations. Tick there for Brazilian Portuguese, tick there for Spanish. Also, when languages are less morphologically complex, when they have geographically expanded, again, Portuguese and Spanish, and have been subjected to dialect mixing, contact with other languages, and L2 acquisition by adults. So there again, we've got all the Brazilian Portuguese fulfills all the requirement for the reduction of linguistic complexity. The problem is that very often you think complexity is a good thing of elaborate languages, and the loss of complexity sometimes can be seen as a bad thing. You've got those valiant judgments, which is problematic. But also the problem with these complexity measures is that they never take into account the linguistic variation or diversity. And so complexity is usually calculated via entropy measurement, which I won't go into. It's a complex mathematical statistical measurement. And these entropy measurements are on the basis of paradigms from standard grammars. So this input is markedly different from actual real linguistic usage, and morphological idiosyncratic variation, which you get a lot of in Brazilian Portuguese, and this linguistic diversity is never present in current entropy calculations, which are usually carried out on standard languages and whose methodology is heavily influenced by the ideology that speakers have focused and stable grammars. Now, also, if we look at how complexity, and here I'll finish, is calculated outside languages, outside the literature, and this is why I put this image on of this book, outside linguistics, well, when looking at complex systems, what people highlight is the link between diversity and complexity, and how diversity makes fundamental contributions to the performance of a complex system. So therefore, I'd say that these are some interesting avenues for research, whereas standard language ideology can have huge implications for linguistic theory and outside linguistic theory.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. Like, so much to discuss there, and I know we're not going to have time to discuss it all, but it's great to have heard it anyway. Liv, I'm going to go to you next, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think this was brought up earlier as well, but until quite recently, theoretical, and I think you've just referred to a bit as well, Paul, but the theoretical frameworks that we've used to research language standardization they've often assumed that speakers of standard languages are monolingual. But we know that standard languages always exist alongside other languages and language varieties, often language varieties of the same language. So lots of speakers use the standard actually as an acquired variety alongside at least one other variety or language, often several. So language homogeneity is actually a myth, and the idea that monolingualism is the norm, that's also a myth. So I think research approaches need to take this reality into account, and they are beginning to, but that's quite recent, I think. So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking one kind of obvious way we can approach research on language diversity and standardization is just by broadening the context of our research and the speech communities we include in our research, and lots of you have already said that today. So like looking outside our own particular research context, especially if it's a very globally dominant language context like mine is with French, And aiming to include non-dominant contexts or communities, I think, is really important. So I first really, well, I guess I started thinking about it when I first became aware of the diversity in Quebec. But I really started thinking about it properly when I organised a workshop on language ideologies and non-standard languages, which led to a special issue on those non-standard language varieties. And I called the workshop and the special issue In the Shadow of the Standard, because I wanted to explicitly acknowledge the complex and diverse manifestations and effects of standardization. And I wanted to, I guess, join in with this new wave of scholars who are challenging traditional accounts of standardization. So the languages that were included were very diverse from a range of political and cultural contexts. So regional varieties of major languages like French, English, Turkish, Chinese, and Greek. Social varieties of English, so the multicultural London English that Nicola was talking about earlier, and minoritized regional languages like Catalan and Occitan. So all of the articles were presenting evidence of the linguistic, but also the social and cultural impact of standard language ideologies on these non-standard language varieties. But more importantly, the impact of the ideologies on speakers of the non-standard varieties. So for me, what was a real learning opportunity was the range of methodological approaches and data sources that the scholars were using to examine language ideologies. So a really broad range of methods, linguistic ethnography, heritage linguistics, corpus linguistics, discourse analysis, social psychology. And then there was such a range of data sources. So, normal sociolinguistic things like interviews and questionnaires, speaker observation and match guise tests, also newspaper articles, internet data. So the project also kind of aimed to showcase the benefits of using a range of theoretical and methodological approaches to look at this question of language ideologies and standard language ideology and diversity. So I personally learned a lot from working with the scholars who were working on these contexts, but it was also really useful for my own research to help me contextualize the situation of the French language in relation to other language situations, but also to make me aware of a much broader range of theories and methods that I had been exposed to when I was just concentrating on French. So I guess my point was that if we want to truly determine the social impact of particular language beliefs and behaviours, we need to be more open to diversity ourselves. So not only to new theoretical and methodological approaches or to broadening our research context, but those are good things obviously, but also I think, and you just brought this up, Paul, is questioning our own assumptions and the ideologies that influence us that we're not always aware of. And to move on to things that I think need attention in the future, I guess I think it's important for us not just to research these things, these language beliefs and behaviours, but also to interrogate and illuminate the power structures behind them and to highlight the power imbalances and to challenge these widely held assumptions that we sometimes don't even notice. So obviously, like I just said, broadening the range of language contexts and language communities that we examine is important, and thinking about how common ideologies in our own cultures, but also ideologies that are shared more globally, might be damaging speakers of certain varieties. And then the other thing that I think is important, and I guess I've only really started thinking about it more recently, is including some kind of knowledge exchange in our projects if we can. So not just going into communities and researching them, but working together to document and validate non-standard language varieties as part of the community's linguistic and cultural heritage, which you've seen earlier, Natalie and Nicola are doing that kind of research, and it's really, really valuable. There's a lot of work as well on heritage language communities in this country. So I'm working on the French. Do I still have another couple of minutes to talk about this? Oh yeah, so I'm working on the French-speaking heritage language community in the UK, which has been overlooked as a heritage language community because French is seen as being this prestigious modern foreign language. French speakers in the UK are generally seen as quite rich, elite speakers. But actually, lots of the French speakers in the UK come from African and Caribbean French-speaking areas and don't use standard French. And they're not viewed as elite expatriates, they're viewed as immigrants. And for those features, French is a heritage language. But it's just been completely overlooked, this dual status of French in scholarship and in language planning. So I'm trying to uncover, I guess, the true diversity of the Francophone community in the UK through sociolinguistic and linguistic ethnographic research in supplementary schools. So hopefully to kind of highlight some of the social and linguistic barriers that members of the community face and show how standard language ideology negatively impact speakers of minority varieties. So I guess this knowledge exchange approach, where we work with participants together rather than just coming in and doing research or imposing research, should be an important driver of future research, so that we really involve the speech communities looking at in our research, and that we have it be like an exchange of ideas. That takes a lot of time and commitment. It's not the easy option, but I think if we're thinking about the social impact of our research, it could be a really important direction.
That's great. Thank you very much, Liv. I mean, you made so many good points there, and as you say, some of them have come up in what we've been talking about earlier, so it's great to have those being picked up again. And yeah, absolutely, working with people who are affected by the research that we're doing and by the questions that we're asking. Carlos, Faraco, if I can come to you now.
Okay, thank you. Well, on research approaches and future perspectives on standardization, I'd say, first of all, that I understand that despite the linguistic heterogeneity of any society, modern mass society needs to define a standard variety. This is a first principle. And observing the evident failure of the exocentric standardization of Brazilian Portuguese, I also understand that the most efficient standardization process must be founded on an endocentric process. It must emerge from the sociolinguistic reality of the society in question. And I also understand that the standard variety is not for universal use, but is correlated to certain social cultural environments, such as the mass media and especially writing activities marked by formality. In this sense, standardization does not necessarily oppose diversity, either because the standard variety has its specific social cultural spaces, or because the standard variety itself encompasses internal diversity in relation, for example, to its use in different textual genres. This is obvious to us linguists, but not necessarily to society at large. I think then that we should develop research that demonstrates with increasing accuracy the internal diversity of the standard variety. At the same time, in a society like Brazilian society, whose sociolinguistic reality is fractured, where there are strong stigmas against non-standard varieties and rejection of the idea of internal diversity of standard variety, I believe that a fundamental line of research is the one that deals with language attitudes. The challenge here is to understand them and to know how they materialize. But above all, it's necessary to investigate in conjunction, for example, with anthropology and social psychology, whether it is possible to change attitudes and to fight linguistic prejudice, and how we can achieve this goal. In other words, how to deal with linguistic ideologies. And I must confess that I am quite pessimistic about the impact of our research on society, particularly on societies born out of colonialism. I do not diminish the importance of our research, of course. The more we know about the functioning of linguistic diversity in our societies, the better. However, having worked with sociolinguistic and normative issues for almost half a century, I identify resistances that seem unsurmountable regarding what we say about linguistic diversity and standard variety. There is a political dimension in our relations with society that transcends our expertise as researchers, and I perceive that we are generally ill-equipped to act in this sphere, particularly in a society like Brazilian society, which, having been a slave-based economy for 300 years, has the DNA of authoritarianism and consequently has a dogmatic view of linguistic reality. That is why I argue that we should primarily research linguistic attitudes toward diversity and non-standard variety and standard variety. On the other hand, I believe that a fundamental task of ours is to adequately disseminate the results of our research. To do this, we need to find the most effective ways to reach the general public, which is always so resistant, in the case of Brazil, to any more open stance towards linguistic diversity and standardization. And this also requires research, interdisciplinary research involving, again, anthropology, social psychology, education, and mass communication. And finally, I think it's essential to rethink the concept of standardization and standard variety, opening up to a more democratic conception of normativity, where there is, above all, less room for impositions and more room for choices. Thank you.
Yes, it's an excellent discussion. I have learned a lot with our colleagues. I have only one question, thinking about your considerations. Perhaps Paul, Neil can start, or everyone. Could you say that? Could you think that African varieties of Portuguese could clarify something about the relationship between complexity and the standard and the simplicity that you provided? Because I think that this multilingual situation where Portuguese as a second language can influence our point of view. And then I think you have a challenge for everybody. How can we be more optimistic and think about promoting a new conceptualization of standard in our societies, all societies represented here? That's it.
Paul, you're mute.
Oh, sorry. Paul, you are mute.
Okay, thank you for that question. On the issue of the African varieties of Portuguese, what is interesting is that Portuguese was never, as in Brazil, widely spoken in the African colonies. It was only really quite recently that there was the dissemination of Portuguese there. But what we see is where you can compare the African varieties and the Portuguese varieties and see this level of variation that exists in both, is to have what in linguistics has been termed an ecological perspective, right? And this is championed by researchers such as McLelland in the US, and it's this idea of taking into account the social circumstances in which the language was imposed, and the importance of language can really help to, and the importance of the norm, and the material structures and institutions that were there to enforce this norm. This can be very informative as to the amount of variation and the amount of variation that can exist. That would be the first point. On the second point regarding the future, I'd just like to say I very much liked what Professor Faraco was saying about the role of linguists. And I think what you mentioned, this pessimistic view, but I think it's not. I think it's a very realistic view, and I think it brings me back to research done by Deborah Cameron on I forgot the term, on linguistic hygiene. And what she was saying, she said very often linguists are excluded from important decisions, or we're not seen as relevant in these big questions because we have problems at understanding that language is a social variable and value can be attached to it, and this value is socially created. And us as linguists, we love languages and we see the inherent value. And so what we do very often in our linguistic courses is we tell students that there's no good or bad varieties, there's not more beautiful or more ugly varieties. Some varieties are not more elegant or less elegant. All varieties are equal. But in society, that goes against everything which society knows about languages. Some way of speaking does make you seem more intelligent, does make you seem more elegant, etc., etc. And so we have to realize that our value, we love language, but our value and how we value language isn't how speakers value language. And so what we have to see is what is stopping them from having that value, and what can and how can it change. And one very last point, I always think what's really important here, and newsreaders like âncora in Brazilian Portuguese, if you have a newsreader that all of a sudden is speaking non-standard languages, so you have someone speaking Scouse doing the news, or someone speaking what would be called popular Brazilian Portuguese and being able to do the news in that way, saying a gente, etc., etc., then in one generation, that value system can change. It can be really small things like that, actually, which now in the UK is changing bit by bit. But still, Scouse and Geordie are still relegated to sort of the gossip things on the news. But anyway, I think I've spoken enough. Thank you very much.
Can I interject and say the same thing's happening in Quebec? So before, when people talk about Le Français Radio Canada, so it's a bit like BBC English, Radio Canada is like Quebec, equivalent of BBC. And it used to be much more Parisian, I guess, in the past, and now it's more acceptable to have a local accent. But also in Quebec, they have now created their own dictionary, which starts from the point of view of Quebec French, and things are marked as being Quebec or French usage, but they're not marked. It's not a value judgment marking, whereas in the past, all of the dictionaries actually started from a French dictionary and added in Quebec usages, and then they were marked as archaic or regionalisms. But of course, from the point of view of Quebec, they aren't archaic usages. They never fell out of the usage in Quebec. They're only archaic if you compare to the standards of France. So there are changes happening, I think, towards an acceptance of more diversity. But they're really small changes, and it's all a question of degree, because if you have a very strong Quebecois accent or you use a lot of Quebecois syntax or vocabulary, you're going to face discrimination. That's really true, but it does show that things can change, I suppose. I don't think we have to be completely pessimistic, is what I'm saying.
Okay, Professor Faraco, a bit optimistic view now.
Well, I think that the problem with language and is what Paul has just said, that there is a conflict between scientific results and social values. We could mention here the evolution theory. It's still quite polemic in society, although it's a strong scientific theory with practical results for our health, for example, dealing with viruses, for example, and it's still quite polemic in society, especially from when we hear people from a religious or any other background. But this is half of the problem when language is concerned. I think that it's easier to deal with the polemics around evolution theory than with social values about language. And I agree with Paul, if we could make more audible, I don't know if the word is correct, but more people listen to non-standard varieties in music, in poetry, in whatever, in the media in general. I think that we could start changing the attitudes. People's feeling that non-standard varieties are quite interesting, and they have a strong, powerful, a strong artistic possibilities. And I think, and the second point is education, right? Which in Brazil is quite complex, because we have not achieved universal education to everyone. So one of our main goals here in our society is to get a lot of efforts dedicated to education, scientific education and language education.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I think you have to close our panel and our meeting with you. Please remain here. I think this event, we have finished now, a bit more optimistic in the way we can say that this Congress, this seminar, this symposium, and the many other things universities do, University of Nottingham, University of Brazil, can promote the magnitude of diversity of multilingualism and show society the beauty, how beauty is standard and non-standard varieties, and inside them we have several varieties and meaning for us to build. So I think we had a great event, and I'd like to thank my colleagues here. And especially Paul, Olivia, and Faraco for this great panel. Thank you, everybody, and thank everybody who is in the chat. Please,
and in the other panels, likewise. Thank you very much to all our participants today. And we haven't had nearly enough time to talk about things, but I've got lots to think about, and I hope that other people who have taken part have got things to think about as well. So huge thanks from me as well.
Yeah.
I would like to also thank all of you, all the guest speakers. It was really a great morning and afternoon, and I believe we can continue this conversation because there are so many important points here for us to continue researching and find ways to make it visible or audible.
Oh, bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Muito obrigado.